Welcome to the screencast Writing a Literature Review. This is part 1 of 4, The Role and Purpose of a Literature Review. This is a graduate writing workshop from the University of Saskatchewan, and my name is Heather McQuinney. I'm Graduate Writing Help Specialist with the university. Let's review the learning outcomes for part 1. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe the role of a literature review, explain the purpose of a literature review, and create a research space in a literature review for your own study. And here's what we're going to do in this screencast. We'll first define a literature review and explain its function. Then we will review types of literature reviews. We'll move on to describe the purpose of a literature review in a proposal or thesis. And finally, we'll explain how to create a research space or CARS for your own study in a literature review. But first, what is a literature review? Well, of course, the literature is the body of scholarly work on a particular topic. And a literature review is a formal analysis and assessment of this body of work. And in analyzing and assessing this body of work, the literature review surveys, highlights, summarizes, synthesizes, interprets, and critiques the body of work. And actually, literature reviews have strict conventions, and they can even be formulaic. But they do differ among disciplines, so it's a good idea to find out the requirements for literature reviews in your discipline. Now, there are several types of literature review. First, there's the literature review that we're all familiar with, an essential part of proposals, theses, dissertations, research papers, and reports. There's also the review paper. It's a published article which, instead of presenting primary research, synthesizes and may critique the work that has been done on a particular topic. And then there's the mini literature review. This is a course assignment that asks you to explore a restricted number of publications in answering a particular question. Well, in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the literature review as part of a proposal or thesis. What's the purpose of this kind of literature review? Well, it reveals what is known about your topic. And in doing that, it demonstrates how the literature you've chosen supports and explains the choices you've made about your study. So at the center of your literature review should be your own research questions. They should be the guiding principle of the review. So the review should be more than a description of the studies in the field. It should synthesize and critique the literature, and in so doing, expose gaps, shortcomings, inconsistencies, and debates from which your research emerges. And so it should show how these gaps or shortcomings led not only to your own research, your own topic, but to your research questions and to your research method. And the literature review should only include pertinent or relevant works, the works that are pertinent for your topic, for your research questions. And these pertinent works should be, as I said earlier, not just described, they should be critically analyzed. So in doing all these things, as you write your literature review, what you are doing is you're making an argument for your own study. You're building a case for why there's a need for your own study. So let's just go over then the purpose of a literature review just in a nutshell. Number 1, to explain how and why you chose your research question and method. Number 2, to demonstrate how the literature you've chosen supports and explains the choices you've made about your study. Number 3, to synthesize and critique this literature. So there are basically three parts to the task of writing a literature review. The first one is identifying the relevant literature and organizing the literature, and then organizing and writing the review itself. Well, in this presentation, in the 4 parts of this presentation on the literature review, we're going to focus on organizing and writing the literature review itself. We'll talk a little bit in part 2 about organizing the literature that you find, but we're not going to address finding and identifying the relevant literature. If you need help with finding and identifying your literature, I suggest that you get in touch with the research librarian who is assigned to your department or to your faculty. Each department has a specialized librarian, and these people are very knowledgeable about how to find literature, how to search for literature. So I highly recommend that you contact the person who has this role for your department. So moving on then, Swales and Feek suggest that you should think about your literature review as a story. Your literature review should tell a story that indicates why you chose your study. And this story should be logical, persuasive, and above all, interesting. It should help the reader to see that your research matters to the world. And in thinking of your literature review as a story, you might find it's easier to write, and certainly it will be more engaging for your readers. So where do you place the literature review? Where does it go in your proposal or thesis? Well, it appears near the beginning. Usually the introduction contains a brief overview of the literature, and then this overview is typically elaborated on in a special section of the paper that contains a more thorough literature review. There are basically 2 formats for the beginning sections of theses. There's the one on the left, which starts with the abstract, then goes on to the introduction, and then the literature review. You can think about these as sort of circles. A small circle and gets bigger in the introduction and bigger in the literature review. The other format is just an abstract and a combined introduction and literature review. This is more common in the engineering fields. I'd like to move on now to talk about the Create a Research Space, or CARS model. John Swales, in 1991, John Swales is a well-known linguist, and he analyzed 30,000 research papers and dissertations he had an idea of the pattern that is used in introductions and literature reviews. And he found that most introductions and literature reviews take what he describes as an approach with 3 main moves. And he calls this approach the CARS model. And he does that because he says that most authors create a research space for their own research. And he describes the main moves that they use to create the research space as establishing the research territory, identifying a niche, and occupying the niche. And Key and his co-author Christine Fake elaborated on these moves in later research. So let's look more closely at the moves. First, establishing a research territory. And Swales and Fake indicate that you do this by presenting background or context information about the topic or problem, demonstrating that the general research area is key, central, problematic, or relevant, and reviewing and synthesizing previous and current related research. So when you're writing an introduction or a literature review and you're creating a research space, you generally start by establishing the research territory. The next move identified by Swales and Fake is identifying a niche. Once you've established the general, more broad research territory, you then identify a niche within that territory. And you do that by announcing a gap or shortcomings in the existing research or in a real-world problem, by questioning the findings or methods of the existing research, or indicating your intention to continue a research tradition. And of these three, the first two are definitely the most common ways of identifying the niche. Now, once the niche is identified, then you must occupy it. And you do this by stating the nature and purpose of your research, listing your research questions and hypotheses, announcing principal findings. Of course, that is only in theses and papers, not in proposals. Stating the value of your research, which the authors indicate as optional, and indicating the structure of the paper or proposal, which is also optional. So these are the three moves that Swales and Fake have identified for creating your research space, starting with establishing a research territory, identifying your niche, and then occupying that niche. So now that we've gone over these moves, let's look at, see if we can see them at work in an abridged introduction of a student proposal. Access to safe drinking water is essential for human health, yet natural processes and human activities often put drinking water sources at risk. Drinking water protection varies greatly across Canada, but it is particularly weak on First Nations. In 2010, 75% of First Nation on-reserve water systems assessed posed a threat to human health. One way for communities to sustain healthy water is to develop a source water protection plan, which aims to reduce the risk of waterborne contamination at the water source. Source water protection plans also make economic sense for at least three reasons. Although Saskatchewan has implemented source water protection plans in several communities in the south, no plans are in place in the north. Furthermore, no feasibility studies appear to have been conducted on using source water plans in northern Saskatchewan, the region of the province most at risk from unsafe drinking water. The purpose of this research is to fill this need by working with three communities in northern Saskatchewan to develop a source water protection plan. So you can see the three moves working in this abridged introduction. The author, the writer, starts by identifying like a general statement here about the need for drinking water, establishing the context, and then moves on immediately to the general problem. And then she kind of narrows down to Canada, the situation in Canada, and to First Nations, being more specific about the problem of water in the First Nations. And she talks about solutions, and in this section, I haven't included all of it here, but she does bring in quite a few sources into this section and synthesizes the research about solutions to water problems. So all of this, of course, is establishing a research territory, identifying the problem and synthesizing the research. Then in the next paragraph, you'll see that she identifies the niche. She does that, of course, right here, saying there are no plans in the north, no source water plans in the north, and no feasibility studies. So that's the identification that here of the niche that she's going to later occupy. And then she does occupy the niche by stating the purpose of her own research. And in the next paragraph, she writes about the objectives. So you can see then how these three moves work, starting with establishing the research territory, identifying the niche, and then occupying it. So to sum up, a literature review synthesizes and critiques a body of work to support and explain the choices you've made about your study. And your literature review should create a research space. There are 3 moves in the Create a Research Space, or CARS model: establishing a research territory, identifying a niche, and occupying the niche.